Okay, so in this lecture, we're going to take a look at a metaethical position called divine command theory, and then also a related position called natural law theory. And we're going to find out in the end that natural law theory is sort of a natural consequence of the uh, shortcomings or troubles that are generated by divine command theory. So let's start with a basic definition of divine command theory, and we'll call that DCT for short. The basic idea here is that the moral good is equivalent to what God or God's command. And so I have it phrased that way, God or God's, because the theory can apply equally to monotheistic, meaning religious systems with one God, or polytheistic religious systems with many gods. But the basic idea is that morality is created by a divine being or beings. But we need to be a little more technically precise with the implications of accepting that equation. So when I'm talking about divine command theory in this discussion, I mean this more precise version down here, these four statements. So let's go through those individually. So if one commits to DCT, to divine command theory, they are committing to one, that an act is morally right if it is commanded by God. So what this entails is that the only way that something can be deemed morally right is that it's a result of a commandment by a divine being. There's no other avenue to the nature of right and wrong. So, in other words, if you're a divine command theorist, you're sort of putting all of your ethical eggs in one basket. There's only one way to justify, on a fundamental level, the nature of right and wrong, and that's through the commands of a divine being or beings. Okay, so that's the first requirement. An act is morally right if it's commanded by God. Then we have to handle morally wrong actions. An act is morally wrong if it's contrary to the commands of God. That's our second statement here. So if God commands X and someone does not X, then they have committed a morally wrong action. So by accepting 1 and 2, we've defined both morally right and morally wrong actions. 3, an act is morally permissible if God asserts no command with respect to that act. So although we've covered morally right and morally wrong actions with 1 and 2, we still haven't covered morally permissible actions. And morally permissible actions would be actions where the divine being or beings make no assertion at all about those given actions. So take Judeo-Christian ethics. God, the God of Christianity, Old Testament or New Testament, doesn't say anything about whether you can eat chocolate or strawberry ice cream. So eating both strawberry and chocolate ice cream would be morally permissible, since there's no command with respect to those specific things. So if we accept 1, 2, and 3, then we have handled morally right actions, morally wrong actions, and morally permissible actions. And then finally, if God does not exist, then nothing is morally right, morally wrong, or permissible. Meaning that if we define a morality with respect to the commands of a divine being, then if that being doesn't exist, then in no meaningful sense can you have morality. Like I said, all your ethical eggs are in one basket, and so the nature of morality would hinge on the existence of a divine being and then the commands of that divine being. Okay, so that gives us, I think, a pretty clear idea, precise idea, too, of what divine command theory is all about. So there's a lot to that, but remember the general idea here is that the moral good is equivalent to what God or God's command. Okay, so what are some general obstacles for divine command theory? This is philosophy, and so we want to look at, we want to be intellectually honest and look at some of the problems that the divine command theorist might have to confront. And now these are not philosophical refutations of divine command theory. These are just the sort of general obstacles that would have to be overcome in order for the theory to be considered philosophically successful. So one of those is philosophical proof of God's existence and nature. In order for divine command theory to be rationally defended, one would have to offer rational justification for belief in a divine being, and then also rational justification for articulations of the nature of that divine being. In other words, what is that being like, and what kind of actions would it be responsible for in reality? So there's an area of study in philosophy called the philosophy of religion, where philosophers attempt to explore those issues. They offer various proofs for and against the existence of God. But for divine command theory to ultimately succeed, those issues would have to be worked out. Now, for our present purposes, we're not going to tackle those issues. That would be for a different class, like the philosophy of religion or introduction to philosophy. We'll just assume when we're analyzing divine command theory that we've resolved those issues, that we know that a divine being exists and we know the nature of that divine being. Second thing that would have to be overcome here as a general obstacle is the determination of canonical religious documents. Canonical just means accepted by religious authorities, meaning those documents that have essentially met the measure of those determining what are the appropriate documents. So the reason this is important is those documents would be the way that human beings would access the commands of God. And so to be sure that you have the right commands, you would have to have the correct documents. So there would have to be some legitimate process of determination of what's canonical and what's not canonical. And so every well-known religion has gone through a process of canonizing its core documents, although there's still disagreements within those religions about what's canon and what's not. It would have to be resolved in order to successfully rationally defend divine command theory. And then finally, even if you have the canonical documents, you have to have accurate interpretations of those documents. A lot of times the way that religious documents are written, they're ambiguous, they're not straightforward, they're metaphorical, allegorical, symbolic, and so there's an interpretive element, and so you would have to know whether or not you have the correct interpretation. Even if the documents have been widely accepted by the religious community, you'd have to agree on the interpretation of those documents. So let's say for our purposes here that we've overcome all these general obstacles, that we have convincing philosophical proof of God's existence and nature. We know what documents are canonical, and we know how to interpret such documents. Then the question is divine command theory a plausible meta-ethical theory from a philosophical viewpoint? Can it be adequately defended philosophically? Okay, so that then leads us to structural criticisms of divine command theory. And so what we're looking at here are not just the sort of sort of environmental obstacles that have to be overcome, like on the previous slide. Now we're looking at the actual structural, philosophical, logical issues with the theory itself. So, like I've said, even though we've assumed that there's a divine being and we know the nature of the being, we know which documents to accept and how to interpret them, there are these further structural criticisms. So the most famous and arguably the most troublesome criticism for divine command theory comes from the philosopher Plato. And so Plato's 429 to 347 BCE. So this shows that this criticism, called the Euthyphro dilemma, is it's an old problem. Divine command theory has been around for a long time. It obviously predates the Christian era, and so even in the time of Plato, philosophers are already grappling with the implications of accepting such a metaethical theory. So the Euthyphro dilemma comes from this criticism of Plato's. The Euthyphro dilemma comes from a dialogue written by Plato called the Euthyphro. Many of the Platonic dialogues, in fact most of them, are titled with the name of the key character in the dialogue. And generally it's that key character or a number of characters having a conversation with Socrates. And many of these characters in these Platonic dialogues were actual people who lived in ancient Greece during the time of Plato, and some didn't, but some were alive during the time of Plato. And so in these Platonic dialogues, you always have this character, Socrates, who's having a philosophical conversation about some particular issue with that key character. And so in the Euthyphro, the question of the plausibility of divine command theory is being discussed between Socrates and Euthyphro. So just to give you the backdrop of what's happening in the Euthyphro, which is not super philosophically important, but it sets the context for where this discussion comes from. Euthyphro's father has committed a crime, at least from the perspective of Euthyphro. And Euthyphro, being a just man, has decided to prosecute his own father. And Socrates runs into Euthyphro, and they begin a discussion about what Euthyphro is up to, and what's his current business. And Euthyphro indicates that he's prosecuting his own father for immoral and illegal actions. And so what Socrates points out is that you must have some real insight into the fundamental nature of right and wrong if you're willing to go as far as prosecuting your father, and then that produces a conversation about the fundamental nature of right and wrong. In the end, Euthyphro ends up advocating divine command theory. He takes the position of the divine command theorist and says to Socrates that the moral good is equivalent to what the gods command. He says gods because it's ancient Greece and it's polytheistic religion in that cultural context. So the Euthyphro dilemma itself really just boils down to a question. So Euthyphro takes the position of divine command theory. He says the moral good is equivalent to what God commands. And then Socrates, which is really Plato's argument through Socrates here. Socrates is a real person, but we don't know whether he actually made these arguments or not. These are certainly the arguments of Plato. And so Plato asks for clarification. He points out that when Euthyphro takes the position that the moral good is equivalent to what God commands, that could be interpreted two different ways. There are two ways to interpret that statement. That's what ambiguous means, just two ways to interpret a given statement. And so he says, essentially, when you say that the good is what God commands, do you mean an action is morally good because God commands it? Or does God command the morally good actions because they are already good? So to put that in a simpler way, when Euthyphro says that the moral good is what God commands, does he mean that God creates morality by commanding it? Or does he mean that the moral good is already out there, God discovers it, and then conveys it to humanity? That's what he wants in terms of clarification. Okay, so I've sort of outlined that same structure on this slide. So if we're looking at this question, is an action morally good because God commands it, or does God command morally good actions because they are already good? Let's call that first part of the question part one. So I'm talking about this first part here on the left side of the comma, right before the disjunction, the or. Is an action morally good because God commands it? That's part one. And then we're going to call this other part of the question, the other side of the or. Does God command the morally good actions because they are already good? We'll call that part two. So let's handle part one first. It's the hardest to understand. What we're going to look at are the philosophical implications of interpreting divine command theory either way, either through the lens of part one or through the lens of part two. So let's say we accept part one, and so remember, this is the view that when someone asserts, like Euthyphro did, that the moral good is what God commands, what they are asserting is that God creates morality, that he by fiat just makes it up. Before God made that decision, there is no nature of the good, there is no morality, nothing is right or wrong, and then God decides what right and wrong are, and then they exist after that. So this is what part one entails. So what are the implications of accepting that view? What happens philosophically if we accept that God creates morality? Well, Socrates points out, really Plato in this case, points out that there are two issues here. One, morality becomes arbitrary, and we need to clarify what arbitrary means. And then also it becomes changeable. And those are devastating consequences for the success of any moral theory. Now, what does it mean to say that morality becomes arbitrary if it's something that's just purely created by God, just by fiat made by a divine being? Arbitrary means that it's chosen based on no standard. Another way of thinking about this would just be random. If you choose something randomly, you're choosing it arbitrarily. You're not choosing it based on any defined standard. So, if you, let's say you go into a convenience store and you're going to decide what kind of soda that you're going to purchase. If you just close your eyes and just randomly grabbed a particular type of soda, you'd be arbitrarily choosing it. So what Plato is pointing out here is that if God is just creating morality, he just out of thin air creates it, he doesn't have a standard to guide him in creating it. In other words, there's no metric or previously existing moral standard that he would use as guidance to determine what those commands would be. If there were previous standards, then that would be accepting part two, that the actions that are morally good already exist independently of God. So that means if God just by fiat just says, here's the good, he would have to be doing so with no outside standard to guide him. Now, you might think, okay, what's the big deal if morality is arbitrarily chosen as long as it's the divine being who's choosing it? Arbitrary systems are not really systems, right? For example, if I told you that the grading scheme in this course would be arbitrary, meaning that you would, complete all the work that I've asked you to complete, but you don't know whether you're going to get a good grade or not because there's no standard that I'm using to actually measure whether you've accomplished what I've asked you to do in the appropriate way. You wouldn't want to enroll in a course that has arbitrary grading standards. You'd make claims like it's not fair, that it's unjust, and so forth. And that's what it means to be arbitrary, to be not fair. There's no universal standard that applies across to every single individual. So the acceptance of an arbitrary moral system would be tantamount, it would be equivalent to accepting the irrelevance of the moral system itself. Of course, God could command it and enforce it, but it wouldn't be a system that has the same merit as one that's not arbitrarily chosen. So let's relate to that this issue of changeability also. If God just creates morality, just makes it up based on no previous standard, then there's no constraints on God changing that moral standard. So God could change morality at any given time, and it wouldn't be morally wrong to do so because he determines what's morally right or morally wrong. In other words, he could make it morally right for him to change the moral standard. So you might think, okay, well, as long as he conveys to us the change, then, big deal, moral standard's been changed. But it would be acceptable within this framework for God to change the moral system and not even convey to us that the change has occurred. So just think about it in terms of the sort of standard Judeo-Christian way of thinking about this. You live your life according to the initially arbitrarily chosen standards, which is troublesome in and of itself. But you live this perfect moral life, let's say, with respect to those standards. And then you die, you're presented to God for evaluation for salvation and damnation. And God says, well, I see you followed my initial standards, but I changed those standards, so you've lived an immoral life and you're going to be condemned forever. Now, in your defense, you'd say, but you didn't tell me about the change in those moral standards. And he would say, yes, but I determined what's right and wrong, and I made it right, morally right, for me to change the moral system and not convey the change to humanity. So the upshot of accepting part one is that we end up with a completely unacceptable set of moral principles. They are arbitrarily chosen. They're not chosen based on some standard like, outside standard like justice or fairness or equity or maximizing happiness, maximizing pleasure. There's no metric being used at all in choosing the moral standards. And then at any given time, those moral standards could change, and they could be changed even without that change, the knowledge of that change being conveyed to humanity. So that's a troublesome position, obviously, for anyone trying to make sense of the nature of right and wrong. So what happens then if we abandon interpreting divine command theory through the lens of part one and then go with part two? So let's say we accept that God commands morally good actions because they're already good. Well, if we accept interpretation two here, part two, then we could obviously overcome the arbitrariness issue and the changeability issue. The moral code wouldn't be arbitrarily chosen if we accept part two, because there's some outside standard independent of God that God uses to determine what's right and wrong. So if you want to think of it this way, God looks at that independent standard as the guide for what's right and wrong. He commands that independent standard and conveys those commandments to us. So in part two, God sort of plays the role of the conduit, right? He allows for the transmission of knowledge of the good from one place in reality to another, from the fundamental nature of morality to us. So now that would obviously overcome the arbitrary issue, but also changeability, since the moral code is independent of God. He doesn't determine it. He doesn't create it. He can't change it, and so morality is static. So we wouldn't have to worry about the moral code being something different than what we'd been initially told. Now, what happens though if we accept that philosophically? What are the implications for the supporter of religiously based ethics? Well, if we accept part two, then God can't be omnipotent. So omnipotent is just this fancy word for all-powerful. Omni means all, potent means powerful. And so if the nature of the good is independent of God's decisions, then he can't change that. It's just part of the nature of reality, beyond what he can control. And if he can't control the nature of the good, then he couldn't be an omnipotent being. Now, that may not be devastating for some philosophically, but many religious believers take God's omnipotence to be a fundamental attribute, along with properties like omniscience, all-knowingness, and omnibenevolence, all-lovingness. And so, there's a way through here, but it requires a compromise to minimize, to some extent, what God is capable of. But in a deeper way, there's a bigger issue here with accepting part two. We've essentially abandoned divine command theory, because although God plays an important role here, he acts as the conduit, and he conveys the nature of morality to humanity. He is no longer the source of the good. And so remember, the whole point of setting out on this meta-ethical journey with divine command theory was to ultimately explain the fundamental nature of the good. The source of it, what gives it, what makes a moral truth, what justifies morality. And if we accept part two of the Euthyphro dilemma, then we don't have an answer to that question. All we know is that God would play some important role in conveying those moral truths. But we are not adhering to the basic premise of divine command theory itself if we accept part two. God does not play that fundamental role with the nature of morality anymore. Okay, so now there are ways to get through this. There are resolutions to the Euthyphro dilemma, but they all require some kind of compromise. Both of these do. And this is not an exhaustive list. There are other ways to do this, but these are the more widely discussed ways of attempting to work through the issue. So one possible resolution to the Euthyphro dilemma is to accept that the good is independent of God, of God's commands. So we accept that second half of the dilemma, and then emphasize God as playing a key role in the implementation of morality. So it is true that even if we accept the second half of the dilemma, without God, we could not have knowledge of it. We wouldn't have epistemic access. Epistemic just means a fancy philosophical word for knowledge. So to have knowledge of morality, we have to have a relationship with God and access morality through God. So also, God would be responsible for creating all of reality except for the good, of course. And so he would be responsible for playing a key role in creating a reality where that moral code matters. And devising a scheme of reward and punishment. And just to make that a little simpler, what I mean is that, when he's creating a universe, he could create a universe where the laws of nature are structured in such a way that, let's say, murder couldn't occur. People just couldn't kill each other. And if he did that, if there's a moral principle that says murder is morally wrong, it would be an irrelevant moral principle. because murder can't take place in that universe. So for the moral code to make sense on a practical level, for it to be meaningful on a practical level, the universe has to be structured in such a way, and God could be responsible for creating and structuring such a universe. So in this way, trying to thread through the dilemma, we are giving God a significant role, but he still loses that fundamental place of being the creator of the moral good. Now, another way through this is to accept natural law theory. And that's going to involve some compromise here too, but it may be a way that works intellectually. So I want to spend a little time now looking at the way natural law theory might provide a resolution to this dilemma presented by Plato. So one of the most famous natural law theorists was the philosopher Thomas Aquinas. So he's in the 13th century, so we're in the late Middle Ages, and what Thomas Aquinas essentially does is he discovers the works of Aristotle and Plato, and particularly Aristotle, and he sort of makes it his philosophical mission to synthesize. He sees the importance of Aristotle's works, but he's a devout Christian also, and so he sees the importance of synthesizing Christian thought and Aristotelian philosophy, Greek philosophy, and so on. So this is where natural law theory comes from. Aristotle has a similar view of reality, but he doesn't develop it in a way that Aquinas does, obviously with respect to Christian values. So the general idea behind natural law theory and Aquinas' version of natural law theory is that natural law theory is a moral theory that says there are objective moral principles found in nature and human reason. So the basic idea is that God builds into the nature of reality, into each individual, the fundamental nature of right and wrong. And if human beings use their rational faculties appropriately, they can discover these natural moral laws, the laws that were traceable back to God. And so the implications then is that moral order is built into nature, meaning that certain actions are right or wrong based on human nature and the natural purpose of things. And the natural purpose of things and human nature are traceable back to the decisions of God. Reason reveals moral truth, so through our rational faculties we can discover what's good by using reason to understand human nature and its goals. The natural laws are universal and unchanging. Natural law applies to all people, regardless of culture or religion. So the Buddhists have the same rational faculties that we do, the Hindus, Christians, every ilk of a religion. The participants of those religious systems have the same natural laws built into them and the same rational faculties, and they can arrive at the same moral principles. And so it acts as a foundation for human laws. Just laws must be based on natural law, and otherwise they are unjust and lack true authority. So when we create a legal system, for it to be a just legal system, it has to be traceable back to those natural laws. So one of the benefits of natural law theory is that it would ground morality and human reason traceable back to God, and then we could predicate our legal system on those natural laws that are acquired through reason. So now the way Aquinas lays it out, it provides an opportunity to try to slip by some of the issues of the Euthyphro dilemma. And to understand that, we need to understand Aquinas' 4 types of law. So the first one and most important here for our purposes in evaluating the Euthyphro dilemma is eternal law. So according to Aquinas, eternal law is God's overarching rational plan for all of creation, left out of there. And so eternal law is unchanging and identical with God's nature. So what Aquinas is doing here to avoid the Euthyphro dilemma is he makes the moral good equivalent with God. It's not something independent of God, it's part of God's fundamental nature. So in that way, he's not accepting entirely the second half of the Euthyphro dilemma. And he certainly avoided the first half because there is some permanent standard of right and wrong. It's God's nature. Now, he still has to confront the issue of God's omnipotence, because if the eternal law is part of God's fundamental nature, that nature can't be changed. And if that's the case, then he would be and a being who lacks the ability to change its own nature and would not be all powerful, would lack omnipotence. Now, if you went the other route and said, well, but God could change his nature if he wants to, then that would take us back to the first half of the Euthyphro dilemma. That would mean that God could change his nature and thereby change the fundamental nature of morality just by choice. And so we'd end up with the problems of arbitrariness and changeableness. So what Aquinas is doing here is trying to ground morality in something that's clearly identical with God, and avoid the standard of moral good being independent of God himself. But he still is not able to skirt around that issue of God's omnipotence being compromised. Okay, so that's the eternal law. That's the overarching rational plan built into the nature of God himself. Then you have natural law. These are the moral rules written into human nature, discoverable by reason and rooted in God's eternal order. So in this case, the moral law is it comes from God's nature. It's implemented into human beings themselves, and we can discover that moral order by just exercising our rational faculties. And somebody who's behaving immorally, Aquinas would argue, is that they haven't exercised their rational faculties. And then you have human law. This is the application of natural law to everyday life through rules created by people. It's valid only if it aligns with moral principles grounded in reason and nature. So we're talking about our legal code. The rules of driving, the rules about how you pay your taxes, those sorts of things. That would be human law, and those laws are only just if they align with the natural law, which is traceable back to the eternal law. And then finally, there's divine law, and this is just God's revealed will that directs us toward eternal happiness, complementing reason and guiding moral lives. So what Aquinas is doing here is he's added this category of divine law because there are certain times where God might want to, through direct intervention, reveal the nature of the good. God comes down from the heavens and commands X, Y, and Z, or he, through religious, interaction with a single individual, conveys the nature of the good. Like Moses goes to the top of Mount Sinai, and God reveals the Ten Commandments to him, and then the Ten Commandments are codified in writing. So those would all be instances of divine law where, through direct revelation, the nature of the good is conveyed to humanity, as opposed to natural law where we arrive at it through our own rational faculties. Okay, so that's what Aquinas does with natural law theory, and you can see it's an attempt to overcome at least some of the issues of divine command theory generated by the Euthyphro dilemma, but some of those same nagging concerns still hang around, even with respect to natural law theory. Primarily, uh, the good is not independent of God; it's part of Him, but nevertheless He can't change His nature. And if you decide that He could change His nature, then you're driven back to the first half of the dilemma, where morality becomes arbitrary and changeable. Okay, so that's it for divine command theory and natural law theory. If you have any concerns or questions, don't hesitate to email me. I'll see you on the next video.